writer with an exceedingly sharp eye. Her first book, River of Doubt, was inspired by the historian James Chase, who simply mentioned in passing one day that he'd never seen a book about President Teddy Roosevelt's harrowing trip down the Amazon. Fascinated by the few random shreds of evidence that she could find, she threw herself into the research. The result is a book that not only plumbs the wilds of a mighty river, but sounds the depths of a singular American, bristling with adventure, filled with vibrant evocations of nature, informed by a resonant humanity. River of Doubt gives us a Teddy Roosevelt we've never known. Now, with a similar acuity, Candice Millard offers up a moment in the life of another American president. Destiny of the Republic focuses on James Garfield, a very different man from Teddy Roosevelt, quieter, more circumspect, not at all inclined to adventure, but a man who ended up, nevertheless, in the crosshairs of an assassin's gun. The book is about the shooting of James Garfield, about the doctors who failed to save him from death, about a tragedy that ended up unifying the country. Candice Millard is part biographer, part historian, part adventure writer. She is, if you'll allow me to distill her skills to a single phrase, a bloodhound historian. She's a writer intent on discovering new things about historical figures we think we know all about. Those new things have less to do with offices and responsibilities than the human side of things. If you haven't seen Candice's marvelous essay in the Washington Post last Sunday on how she came upon the very human side of these two presidents, I strongly urge you to look it up online. Just Google Candice Millard, Writing Life, and the Washington Post, and you'll see a very different glimpse into how a writer is shaped and made. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me special pleasure to introduce to you a very talented writer about the interstices of American history, Candice Millard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I have to say Maria Rana is one of my favorite writers, so it's a great honor to be introduced to her, by her, and it's a great honor to be speaking here at the National Book Festival. So thank you so much for coming. At heart, this book is not about politics or science or even the shooting of a president. It is about an extraordinary drama that took place inside the White House over 80 days. In the 130 years since Garfield's death, the story of his assassination has been largely forgotten. But even at the time, even though the entire nation, the entire world was watching, no one really understood what was happening. What began as a shooting became a bitter struggle over personal power and ambition. And the result was the brutal death of one of our most promising leaders at the hands of his own physicians. This is an intimate, heartbreaking story of ignorance versus science, greed versus heroism. James Garfield was not, as he has been remembered to be, just a bland, bearded 19th century politician. On the contrary, he was one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. Although he was born into extreme, desperate poverty, he became a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages by the time he was a sophomore in college. By the time he was 26, he was a university president. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. While he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. To me, though, what is more impressive and even more inspiring than Garfield's brilliance was his decency. You know, I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and I have great admiration for Theodore Roosevelt. He was a firebrand. He was the hero. He was the center of every drama. That's not Garfield. Garfield was the calmest, wisest man in the room. He was a good, kind, honest man who was just trying to do his best. He was a real person, not consumed by ego. He was sincerely trying to do good things. Even after 17 years in Congress, in one of the most ruthless, vicious eras of machine politics, Garfield never changed. His friends used to marvel at his patience and forbearance, even in the face of the most brutal personal attacks. Garfield was incapable of holding a grudge. He used to shrug and say, "I'm a poor hater." Although Garfield took his presidency very seriously, he had never had what he called presidential fever. In fact, he never ran for any office. People would ask him to run, and he would, but he wouldn't even campaign. And he always made it clear that he was going to act on his own conscience and convictions. And if people didn't agree with him, they shouldn't vote for him. When Garfield went to the Republican convention in 1880, not only was he not a candidate, he didn't want to be one. He had gone there to give a speech, and he was kicking himself because he wasn't prepared. He wrote a letter home to his wife saying that he was just sick about the fact that he hadn't written something beforehand, and now he wouldn't have time. The convention was in this enormous hall in Chicago. There were 15,000 people there, and the favorite to win by far was Ulysses S. Grant, who was trying for a third term in the presidency. In the midst of the chaos and noise of this convention, thousands of people, Garfield got up to speak. And that speech was so powerful and so eloquent and, again, extemporaneous that the hall slowly fell silent until all you could hear was Garfield's voice. And the audience was just riveted. They were spellbound. And at one point, Garfield said, "And so, gentlemen, I ask you, what do we want?" And someone shouted, "We want Garfield!" And the entire hall just went crazy. And when the balloting began, delegates started casting their ballots for Garfield. And again, he wasn't even a candidate. He stood up and he tried to stop what was happening, but the votes just kept coming. And a trickle became a stream, became a river, became a flood of votes. And before he knew it, Garfield was the Republican nominee for President of the United States. What I found again and again and again while researching this book was that not only was Garfield's life and his nomination and his brief presidency filled with incredible stories, but the people surrounding him were equally unbelievable. You just couldn't make them up. First, of course, there is Charles Guiteau, who was Garfield's would-be assassin. He was a deeply, dangerously delusional man, but very intelligent and incredibly articulate. If you read most accounts of Garfield's assassination, Guiteau is described as a disgruntled office seeker, but that doesn't cover the smallest part of it. Guiteau was a uniquely American character. He was a product of this country at that time. It's a time when there was a lot of play in the joints. There was no one to really understand what he was up to and hold him to account for it. Guiteau was a self-made madman. He was smart and scrappy. He was a clever opportunist, and he probably would have been very successful if he hadn't been insane. Guiteau tried everything, and he failed at everything. He had tried law, he had tried evangelism, he had even tried a free love commune, and he had failed even in that. The women in the free love commune nicknamed him Charles Get Out. But he survived on sheer audacity. He traveled all over the country, never by train, never buying a ticket. He took great pride in moving from boarding house to boarding house and slipping out when the rent was due. And even when he occasionally worked as a bill collector, he would just keep whatever he happened to collect. After the Republican convention, Guiteau became obsessed with Garfield. And immediately after the election, he began stalking him. He went to the White House nearly every day. At one point, he even walked into the president's office while Garfield was in it. He sat on a bench outside of the White House just waiting for Garfield to come out day after day, after hour. He even attended a reception and he introduced himself to Garfield's wife. He shook her hand, he handed her his business card, and he slowly pronounced his name so she wouldn't forget him. It's like a Hitchcock movie. It was incredibly creepy and absolutely terrifying. Finally, Guiteau had what he believed was a divine inspiration. God wanted him to kill the president. It was nothing personal, he would later say, just God's will. As strange and fascinating and nearly as dangerous as Guiteau was Roscoe Conkling. Conkling was a vain, preening, brutally powerful machine politician who appointed himself Garfield's enemy. Conkling used to wear canary yellow waistcoats. He would write with lavender ink. He had this great spit curl in the middle of his forehead, and he recoiled at the slightest touch. In fact, his vanity was so outsized that he was famously ridiculed for it on the floor of Congress by another congressman. But Conkling was no joke. He was dangerously powerful. As a senior senator from New York, he controlled the New York Customs House, which was the largest federal office in the United States and controlled 70% of the country's customs revenue. Conkling tightly controlled patronage within his state, and he expected complete and unquestioning loyalty. In fact, his apartment in New York was known as the morgue. Conkling was enraged when his candidate, former President Grant, didn't get the nomination. But he was apoplectic when he realized that he couldn't control Garfield. To Conkling, the attempt on Garfield's life was his ticket back into power. For the first time in Conkling's life, however, nothing turned out as he had planned. Next, I'm going to talk about Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was Garfield's vice president, but he was Conkling's man. Politically, he was completely Conkling's creation. In fact, the only other political office he had held besides vice president of the United States was as the controller of the New York Customs House, a position that Conkling, through President Grant, had given to him. In this position, he made as much money as the president. He never showed up for work before noon. Arthur preferred a life of leisure. He liked fine clothes, old wine, late dinner parties, and he was even more preening than Conkling. In fact, he even moved his birth date back a year to appear more youthful. Even within the Republican Party, Arthur's nomination to the vice presidency was considered a ridiculous burlesque. And after the election, Arthur continued to make it clear where his loyalties lay. He went on vacations with Conkling, he even lived with him for a time, and he took every opportunity to publicly criticize the president. And then, suddenly, everything changed. After Garfield was shot, Arthur made a transformation that was so stunning and complete that nobody could believe it. The entire country was horrified at the thought that Arthur might become president. But unlike Conkling, Arthur was grief-stricken and devastated by the shooting. The last thing he wanted was for Garfield to die. He hid himself from public view. He refused even to go to Washington for fear that it would look like he was waiting in the wings. And he cut himself off from conquering. Finally, after turning his back on the man who had made him, Arthur found moral strength in the most unlikely of places, in the letters of an invalid young woman named Julia Sand. Julia Sand believed in Arthur when no one else did, when he didn't even believe in himself. After the shooting, Sand wrote to Arthur, "If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the time to let it shine. Faith in your better nature forces me to write to you, but not to beg you to resign. Do what is more difficult and more brave, reform." And to everyone's amazement, not least of all his own, Arthur did. He changed dramatically, and he tried to be the president Garfield would have been had he lived. He became an honest and respected leader, and he never forgot Julia Sand. Not only did he keep her letters, but he wrote her back, and he even went to visit her. After a Sunday dinner one day, Julia was at her brother's house, and this highly polished carriage pulled up, and to her astonishment, out stepped the President of the United States, who had come to thank her in person. If this wasn't real, no one would believe it could happen. The reason Arthur became president was not Guiteau's madness or Conkling's political maneuverings, but the ambition, arrogance, and ignorance of the man who assumed control of Garfield's medical care, Dr. Willard Bliss. That's right, his first name was Doctor. His parents had named him Doctor. Bliss was a well-known surgeon with a profitable practice. In fact, he had been one of the doctors at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed, but he had far from a sterling reputation. He had enthusiastically sold something called Kundurango, which was supposed to cure cancer, syphilis, ulcers, chronic blood diseases, you name it. Bliss had been disgraced for taking bribes, and he had even spent a brief time in prison. When Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who was Garfield's Secretary of War, sent for Bliss after the shooting, Bliss saw in this national tragedy a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for fame and power. He immediately took charge of the president's medical care, even though no one had given him authority. He just took it. He dismissed the other doctors, and he completely isolated Garfield in a sick room in the White House. He wouldn't even let him see his Secretary of State. And what happened in that room inside the White House is nothing short of horrifying. Bliss and the few surgeons he handpicked to help him repeatedly inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in the president's back, searching for Guiteau's bullet again and again, day after day. The last thing Bliss wanted was for Garfield to die. He had too much at stake, but his own arrogance and ignorance were slowly and excruciatingly killing the president. The only hope for Garfield was to find the bullet and end the search, but this was 14 years before the invention of the medical X-ray. What happened next is nothing short of incredible. Only the most brazen novelist would make it up. None other than Alexander Graham Bell stepped forward to help. Bell, a young, restless genius, had invented the telephone just 5 years earlier when he was only 29. By 1881, the telephone had earned him some money and a lot of fame, but he wanted nothing to do with the company that had grown up around it. He said it was hateful to him at all times, and it fettered him as an inventor. Worse than the business itself were the lawsuits against it. There were 600 lawsuits against the Bell telephone, 5 of which made it to the United States Supreme Court. Finally, Bell had enough. He said he was sick of the telephone, and he quit the Bell Telephone Company. Bell just wanted to help people. He had lost both of his brothers to tuberculosis before he was 24. Both his mother and his wife were deaf, and he knew that he could make life better for people, maybe even save lives. But He worked so hard that his parents and his wife were terrified that he would literally work himself to death. When he was working, he wouldn't stop to eat or rest. His only respite was playing the piano deep into the night. But even then, he played with such intensity that his mother, who had taught him to play, called it a musical fever. When Garfield was shot, Bell turned his life upside down to help him. It sickened him to think of Garfield's doctors blindly searching for the bullet. Science, he thought, should be able to do better than that. Bell abandoned everything he was doing, and he spent day and night inventing something called an induction balance. It was basically a metal detector connected to a telephone receiver, which he slowly ran over the president's body, listening for a telltale buzzing that would tell him where the bullet was lodged. In the end, Bell and science were defeated, but not because the invention didn't work. It did work. In fact, it went on to save countless lives before the invention of the medical X-ray. Alexander Graham Bell was defeated by the president's own doctors. As I began my research for this book, the question that kept coming to me was, how could this have happened? What I found, first of all, was that the presidency in 1881 was very different from the presidency today. First of all, Secret Service. This is 16 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and there's still no Secret Service protection for the president. In fact, Garfield had only an aging police officer and his 23-year-old private secretary. Not only was the president not protected from the public, he was expected to interact with them one-on-one, face-to-face, on a daily basis. You have to remember, this is the height of the spoils system, and many Americans believed that they were entitled to government jobs, even if they had no training or credentials for them. More than that, they insisted on making their case directly to the president himself. Garfield was forced to meet with office seekers from 10:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. every day. And the situation made him desperate. He longed for time to work and think, and he wondered why anyone would ever want to be president. But while he found office seekers tiresome and even maddening, he never considered them to be dangerous. He said that assassination can no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it's best not to worry about either. Garfield walked around the city by himself all the time. In fact, one night he left the White House, walked down the street to his Secretary of State's house. They walked together alone through the streets of Washington, with Guiteau following them the entire way, holding a loaded gun. In fact, by that point, Guiteau had been stalking the president for weeks. He had even followed him to his church and considered shooting him there. Finally, he made his decision. The president, he knew, would be at the Baltimore and Potomac train station, which is where the National Gallery of Art stands today, on the morning of July 2nd, 1881, and Guiteau would be waiting. The moment Garfield stepped into the station that morning, Guiteau stepped out of the shadows and shot him twice. The first bullet went into his arm, and the second ripped through his back. By an incredible stroke of luck, however, Guiteau didn't kill Garfield. He only wounded him. The bullet that tore through his back didn't hit his spinal cord, and it didn't hit any vital organs. Today, he would have spent a few nights in the hospital. Even if he had just been left alone, he almost certainly would have survived. Unfortunately for Garfield and the nation, Dr. Bliss stepped in. Bliss took advantage of the fear and the chaos that followed the shooting to assume control of Garfield's medical care. But he was not only ambitious and arrogant, he adhered to the most traditional methods of the time. Bliss gave Garfield, a gunshot victim, rich foods and alcohol. He took great satisfaction in what he called the healthy pus issuing from the president's infected wound, and he avoided any treatment that he considered to be new and radical, including antisepsis. The renowned British surgeon Joseph Lister had discovered and introduced antisepsis 16 years earlier, and the death rate in his own surgical ward had immediately plummeted. He had traveled all around begging doctors to sterilize their hands and instruments and warning them that if they didn't, they ran the very real risk of killing their patients. By 1881, antisepsis was widely adopted in Europe, but the most experienced and respected doctors in the United States still dismissed it as useless, even dangerous. Some of them didn't even really believe in germs. They laughingly referred to them as invisible germs, and they certainly didn't want to go to all the trouble that antisepsis required. They took great pride in what they called the good old surgical stink. They wouldn't change or wash their surgical aprons because they believed the more blood and pus encrusted on them, the more experience it showed. Even those who tried antisepsis had little success for reasons that today seem painfully apparent. They would sterilize their knives, but if they dropped them during surgery, they would just pick them up and continue using them. If they needed both of their hands during surgery, they would hold the knife in their teeth and then continue to use it. Even Alexander Graham Bell could not outrace the infection that was coursing through the president's body. The story, however, doesn't end there. Garfield's death brought about tremendous changes in medicine, in politics, in the fabric of our nation. As soon as Garfield's autopsy was released, Americans understood that their president didn't have to die, and they understood why he did. Bliss was publicly disgraced, and antisepsis was adopted across the country. Americans turned their rage and their grief on the political system that had encouraged a madman like Guiteau. Chester Arthur himself, who owed his entire career to patronage, signed the Pendleton Act, which was the beginning of the end of the spoil system. Garfield's death also brought the country together in a way that had not been seen since the Civil War. Lincoln's assassination had only deepened that divide, but Garfield had been the first president since the Civil War to be accepted as a leader of the whole country, North and South, immigrant and pioneer, freedman and former slave owner. His death was their loss, and their common grief brought them together. Above all, Garfield's death changed the presidency itself. You could argue that this was really marked the end of the idealistic or even naive concept of the president alone meeting with office seekers, personally making appointments at every level of government. It was obviously an unworkable system for a lot of reasons. It was open to corruption, it was completely inefficient, and it was personally dangerous. It would never have worked as the United States grew into a major world power, and it's good that it's gone. But at the same time, these changes also make it almost impossible to ever again elect someone like Garfield. The presidency today is not about a single person, it's about a large, complex institution. The president may be our greatest political celebrity, but his personal power is bounded by and filtered through many layers. He's surrounded by elaborate security, his contact with the public is carefully controlled, and he operates in a bubble of Secret Service officers, high officials, and the press. It's very unlikely that what happened to Garfield could happen today, but by the same token, even if we could find someone like Garfield, we probably couldn't elect him. The presidency is too big and too distant for Americans to be able to choose someone who isn't even trying to be elected. We have hopefully outgrown the day when a madman could just walk into the Oval Office and when an incompetent doctor could seize control of the White House for nearly 3 months. But we likely have also outgrown the day when Americans could recognize the promise of a fine, honest man, a man with no financial support, no political machine, nothing but the strength of his own words and ideas, and in a shining moment of democracy, make him our leader. Thank you. to take questions. Okay.
How did the relationship between Ulysses S. Grant and James Garfield change from the Republican presidential convention and through the assassination of James Garfield? How public or private a role did Grant play in the early days of the Garfield administration?
I think Grant was highly unhappy with the results of the Republican convention, and he seemed to resent Garfield. In fact, Garfield talks in his diary about the fact that Grant was staying in a place in New Jersey, and Garfield's wife had been very sick with malaria, and she was there recovering, and Grant never came to see them. There was no sort of interaction between them besides a curt tip of his hat. So, Conkling was very close to Grant, and Conkling, of course, have been furious with the results of the convention, and so it did affect Garfield and Grant's relationship. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about Garfield the man? I understand he was quite an academic.
He was. He was really a brilliant man. He was a classicist. Because he was very poor, to pay for his first year of college, he was the school's janitor and carpenter. And as I said, by his second year, they promoted him to professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages. He was just a brilliant classicist and absolutely devoted to education. In fact, he had been involved in helping to establish the first Department of Education, which was very small at that time and very different from today, but it was one of the things that he was most devoted to, and he was always an incredibly voracious reader. Reporters would talk about going to his house and finding books and papers everywhere, even in the bathroom. There were just piles and piles of books. Yes.
As you've just pointed out, Garfield was an intellectually brilliant man. He was a polymath, wonderfully well-read, eloquent, a good writer, brilliant writer even, and one of the very, very few genuine intellectuals who's ever been elected President of the United States. Today, we seem very often to be sort of in a race to the bottom, or at least many aspiring candidates seem to fall over each other, proclaiming how unintellectual they are, and seem to take pride in their absence of articulateness. And what do you think has changed in this country, a country which in 1880 was happy to elect a man like Garfield with his broad intellectual range, and today in a country which nominally is filled with people on paper who are far better educated, who seem to dislike it in their candidates?
It's a good question. It's difficult to talk to about today's situation, since I'm always looking at the past. But I think what drew people to Garfield at that time is that because he had come from such poverty, because his parents had been pioneers in Ohio, he had lost his father before he was 2 years old. It was very desperate circumstances, and he had risen through the ranks, not with an overt ambition, but through a love of learning and an understanding of who he was and his own beliefs. And I think that appealed to many people, especially at that time, because I think to them he was one of their own, and showed so much promise and so much hope for them and their children and their grandchildren. I think that's part of what made him so appealing.
Excuse me, the period between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt in terms of the American presidency is not one that's very highly regarded by either historians or the general public, and the power of the presidency was generally in eclipse. I'm sure you must have speculated, at least personally, if not in the book, about what might have been if Garfield had survived to serve out his full term, or perhaps even a second term. What could he have made any really positive contributions to American life as president?
It's of course impossible to say with any certainty, because he, had only been in office for 4 months before he was shot. But I think what was what gave Garfield a particular and kind of rare power is that he was his own man. Because he had never hungered for the presidency, as so many men around him at that time do and still do, he never, he wasn't beholding to anyone, and he understood who he was, and he abided by that, and he didn't change all those years in Congress. So I think that gave him an unusual kind of power and calmness. And he, we think of the vicious fighting today, but at that time, it was even more vicious, and there was fighting even within the Republican Party. There were two warring factions, and Chester Arthur, his own vice president, had been part of the opposite faction, and amazingly, Garfield defeated Conkling, the head of the stalwarts, arguably the most powerful and corrupt man in that country, in just a few months in power. And so you have to believe that someone with that kind of character and with that sort of personal power, because he was his own man, would have made a difference in the country at that time.
Can you talk more on Guiteau's trial? The little I know of it starts with him saying, "I didn't kill the president, I merely just shot him."
That's right. Your Honor, I shot the president. His doctors killed him, which was true. So Guiteau had used the insanity defense, which had been used before. It was early, and it was obviously one of the best known and most controversial insanity defenses at that time. And, frankly, if anyone deserved to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, it was Charles Guiteau. He had been insane for a long time. His family knew it, had tried to have him institutionalized, but he lived this incredibly peripatetic and solitary life, so he would just sort of slip away. But the country was so grief-stricken and so enraged that they were determined to see him hanged, and he was.
Is there a particular staff member who was vital to Chester Arthur's transformation? Did he have a chief of staff or a personal secretary who helped him along that path?
Chester Arthur, as I was saying, made this incredible transformation and found a kind of moral strength I think he didn't know he had through the letters of this young woman, Julia Sant, who was an invalid and a shut-in, and I quote from her letters in the book, but I could have gone on and on and on quoting from her. She was incredibly eloquent, and they're just beautiful letters, and I think she showed him that he could be much more than he was, and he changed. Yes.
A lot of Americans aren't familiar with Garfield. Popularly, one colleague at work thought I was coming to hear someone who wrote a book about a cartoon cat.
That's very unfortunate, I know.
What prompted you, what inspired you to write this book? What was it that sparked your interest in Garfield?
I too did not know really anything about James Garfield beyond the fact that he had been assassinated. And I wasn't necessarily interested in writing about another president. I was interested in science, and I was researching Alexander Graham Bell, and I just kind of stumbled upon this story about him trying to help save Garfield's life, and it really surprised me. I had never heard this story before, and I couldn't understand why Bell, who was really at the height of his fame and power, again, this is only 5 years after he had invented the telephone, would turn his life upside down to try to help Garfield. I mean, he just dropped everything he was doing. He had a family in Boston, a wife, 2 children. His wife was pregnant. And he just worked night and day in this laboratory, and it made me wonder what Garfield was like. And the more research I did, the more astonished I was, and I just knew I had to tell this story. Yeah.
I really enjoyed The River of Doubt. It was a great read. If you could go back...
Thank you very much.
If you could go back in time, this may not be a really fair question, but if you could go back in time and have a beer with Roosevelt or Garfield, who would you have a beer with, and why?
That's a great question. That would be a very difficult decision because they are such different men, you know, and Theodore Roosevelt was so exciting and had all this adventurous life, but you know, I hate to say it, I think I would choose Garfield. My sister is here, and she can tell you, you know, we come from a family of 4 girls, and we have the most incredible father, and just a good, kind, honest man, and for all these years I was working on this book, Garfield reminded me of my father, and he was, you know, such an incredible intellectual, so I think I would have to choose him.
Hi there. As an aspiring journalist and a pretty big fan of history, I'm wondering about the unique challenges that come with when you're writing a book that's primarily about people who lived a long time ago and are no longer, you can't like go interview Teddy Roosevelt today. So the difficulty in writing about the past and being able to make those characters come to life, even though you can't ask them questions directly about their experience and things like that.
That's a great question, and you know, I would say if you know you want to go into writing, to me, one of the things I've learned is that the important part of writing really is finding the right idea, and one of the aspects of finding the right idea, if it's nonfiction, it has to be you have to have a lot of primary sources to work with, and with this story, I had a wealth of sources. For instance, Guiteau, you know, I am in his mind. You know, because of his particular brand of madness, because he was delusional, he was thrilled after the shooting. In prison, he said it was the happiest time of his life because he had reporters coming to him, listening to him, and he gave every interview he could. He wrote an autobiography that was published in the New York Herald. The trial transcript is nearly 3,000 pages long, and again, because they were so worried that he would be found not guilty by reason of insanity and not executed, they went through every aspect of his life, from his childhood, the Free Love Commune, everything, and he describes not just what he did, but what he was thinking, you know, when he had his divine inspiration and all of it. So I know everything. And Garfield, you know, he was only president for 6 months, but he had been in Congress for 17 years. And so our wonderful, wonderful Library of Congress and the Presidential Papers has just a wealth of information. And you never know what you're going to find. I'll tell you a quick story. You know, the Library of Congress and the Presidential Papers, if any of you have worked there, you know they're very, very strict, as they should be. I mean, these are our national treasures. But so you can only have one cart at a time, and it can only have, I think, 5 boxes on it. And you can only have 1 box on your table and 1 folder out of that box and 1 item out of that folder. So I'm a good person. I'm carefully following the rules. And I open this folder and I find this envelope. And the front of the envelope is facing the table. And it's not sealed or anything. I don't know what's in it. So I open it and all of this hair spills out on the table. And I turn it over and it says, "Clipped from President Garfield's head on his deathbed." And so I'm trying to desperately, get it back. My career is over. They're never going to let me back in. But at the same time, I was terrified. It was also incredibly moving to see, these things bring these people to life. You remember that this was not only a president, this was a husband, this was a father. The first thing Garfield did the morning he was shot is he went into his son's room. He was playing with them. They're doing somersaults. He was singing to them. And it was not only a national tragedy, it was a personal tragedy as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.